We're ready, David.
Okay, very good. Well, I am David. Obviously, I'm one of the founding members of Arca, and I guess I'm known as the driver guy. This presentation is a summary of some of the recent developments with the drivers that Arca is working on. The first one of them is, of course, the ACPI driver. Now, I know that the ACPI driver stuff is not really in the news anymore, but it's still really important. And when people say, oh, I installed ACPI, or I didn't install ACPI, or I have an ACPI update, they don't really mean ACPI at all. What they really mean is the ACPI driver, or more specifically, the PSD. And it's the PSD that makes our system still work. In the past, it used to be that you would choose whether or not to use the PSD, depending on whether you thought it might benefit you or you thought it might cause problems. And in fact, there even were installation options called safe mode that would not install the PSD or ACPI. However, now, if you're not using the PSD, then you probably have problems, and your system is definitely not running up to its potential. For most normal situations, you should not even be using any switches on the PSD command line. Even things like /VW mean your system is running degraded and potentially has problems. The so-called safe mode installation options are not even safe at all. And you should always be using the PSD on modern hardware. So in other words, things are a lot different than they used to be. So there are 5 things that the ACPI driver project provides. The first thing is this platform-specific driver. When I say PSD, this is the thing I'm talking about, and this is the most important piece in the project. And then other supporting things are like the DLL for applications, and the daemon, which does power management, operates things like the power button and lid events and stuff like that. And then there's the APM emulator. If you still are using old, really old stuff that uses APM, this will try to provide APM services via ACPI for you. And then, of course, there's a toolkit for anyone who wants to write an application that makes use of ACPI services. Here's another picture of kind of how things fit together. Inside the PSD, which is this section right here. These are the things that the driver project produces. This is the PSD thing here, and the 5 different pieces that I talked about just a little while ago. Just another way of looking at it. And here's another way of looking at what's inside the PSD. It has a lot of different things going on inside there. A very small part of that actually has to do with ACPI itself. There's a lot more that it does. So anyway, let's talk about a little bit about what's going on with the ACPI driver. It is currently at version 3.23.10. It's been pretty stable and reliable. In fact, as I was preparing this presentation, I was going through all the changes and things that have been made recently, and I discovered that there have been no fixes for defects in the PSD for more than 3 years. Think about that. That's more than 3 years of use with no problems. That's pretty stable software. Of course, that doesn't mean there have been no changes. There have been. However, the recent changes have been to add features or to fix problems elsewhere in the system unrelated to the PSD. Why do we use the PSD to fix problems that aren't even related to the PSD? Well, because the PSD is strategically located in the system and it loads very early in the boot process. Also, because the PSD is a kernel plugin and it operates at roughly the same level as the kernel. So it's really an easy place and actually the ideal place to implement a lot of the fixes that we need to do, like kernel fixes, BIOS workarounds, or really anything else that involves the overall system. Some of the recent things that have been done, the most recent thing is the fix for the IPI timeout problem. Now, an IPI is an inter-processor interrupt. And kernel uses these to control the various CPUs in your system if you have more than one. This problem was originally reported as a full screen hang, even though it didn't really have anything to do with full screen sessions. In order to find this problem and fix it, we had to acquire hardware so that I could reproduce the problem locally. And I also had to build special debugging tools to track down and find this problem. And it ended up being a problem in the kernel. The conditions for this are that you have multiple CPUs running at the same time, and your CPU speed is greater than about 3 gigahertz. And the symptoms would be that your system would randomly hang when doing things that needed multiple CPUs, like changing screen graphics modes. So anyway, this was one of the things that was fixed recently. Another thing that went into the BSD was fixing the problems with a GPE storm. A GPE is a general purpose event. Essentially, it's an ACPI interrupt. And it turns out that some BIOS leave various debug junk in the ACPI code, and that causes problems. Well, this fix kind of works around those BIOS problems. There also was some changes, very minor changes to the power manager in the daemon. And this came about because I noticed that every now and then the power management stuff didn't seem to be working the way it was supposed to. This also took some time to track down and figure out what was going on, and it turned out that there is somewhere some external program that was trying to control the processor enable and disable settings, the same settings that the daemon tries to control. Anyway, I never took the extra time necessary to figure out exactly which program this was. I just tweaked the daemon so that it wasn't possible for this to happen anymore. And of course, there is the ongoing, everlasting ACPI C8 updates from Intel. We always got to keep up with the latest stuff from Intel. Now, keep in mind that even with all of these changes, really only generic, standard, reliable systems are going to work. Not every non-standard or peculiar system is going to work or is supported. And this is the way it's always been with OS2. OS2 has always required that your hardware be spec compliant and run correctly. And Arca OS is not any different than that, and it's not guaranteed to run on every single system out there, and it never has been. Beware of cheap hardware, and especially hardware from vendors that cut corners and produce poor quality hardware, because these may not work correctly. And a lot of vendors, some vendors are doing this now. Some vendors are intentionally violating specs because they want to squeak out a little bit more performance or cut costs, or simply they just don't feel like spending the time to meet the specs. And this hardware probably isn't going to work too well. Anyway, that's enough on the ACPI driver project. Let's talk about Multimac a little bit. Multimac, of course, is a framework and a library for porting network drivers to OS2. And it consists mainly of these two pieces. Every network driver has the library, which is something that I developed, and of course the driver itself. Now this driver is basically the FreeBSD driver C code that's mostly unmodified and just compiled using OS2 tools to run on OS2. And then of course the library is what connects it to OS2. And the driver itself is what actually talks to the hardware and does all the controlling of the hardware. And the library is designed to be as thin and as efficient as possible so that it doesn't affect performance. Some drivers do need to be modified slightly. In other words, there's some minor changes to the FreeBSD source code, but these changes are really minor, typically only in the interrupt handler, and are really small, usually 1, 2, or 3 line code. The latest version of the released driver of the package actually that was released on April 14, 2018. Now, beware that multi-Mac distributions are a collection of a whole bunch of different drivers, and each driver inside the package has its own version number. Don't confuse that with the date of the distribution package. The date 2018-0414 is not a version number. It's just when that package of drivers was put together. Each driver inside will have its own version number. And in fact, the same driver with the same version might be distributed in multiple multi-Mac distributions. Anyway, some of the recent changes have been, there have been enhancements routines, and some of these were required to accommodate some of the more newer drivers that were added to the multi-Mac distribution. There have also been better inter-module dynamic linking. One of the things that the FreeBSD drivers do is sometimes they have more than one module that builds a driver. And the way they work is they link these modules together in real time at runtime. And what I did is I implemented a compatible dynamic linking mechanism that will work with these drivers so that I don't have to modify the source code. Some of the more modern, more complex drivers require this even more than the past ones did. One of the really important things that got fixed fairly recently was a fix for packet transmit deadlocks. This is because of the differences between the FreeBSD network stack and the OS2 network stack. And sometimes this difference sometimes packets would get lost or the transmit would just stop completely. I've implemented some spin locks and various other interlocking mechanisms to help prevent this. And as far as I know, this has been totally resolved. There were some enhancements to interrupt handlers. This is also one of the areas that is significantly different between FreeBSD and OS2. They have a totally different way of handling interrupts. And a lot of work has gone into the multi-Mac compatibility driver to help resolve some of these differences, and some additional features were added recently. In fact, these last two items that I mentioned, the difference in the structure of the network stack and the difference in the way the interrupts are two of the most significant differences between FreeBSD and OS2. And consequently, they require the most work and the most cleverness in implementing compatibility routines. And obviously, since that's the case, they have the most problems, or have had the most problems. They require the most time in debugging for development. USB is another significant time thing that's had a lot of work and requires a lot of time. The old version 11 drivers have been stable and reliable, and they have not had any changes recently. They're currently at version 11.17. And there's not really a lot more to say about these. They still work great. They are what they are, but they're no longer in development. Any future changes will be done in the version 12 drivers. And you will see these being released fairly soon. The USB 12 drivers are all 32-bit drivers. They have had quite a bit of changes. One of the things that will be coming up in the USB 12 versions is USB 3 support, and USB 3 support did require using 32-bit drivers, so it made sense to just convert everything up to 32-bit. It makes for a lot of benefits for going to fully 32-bit drivers for the USB stack. They are significantly different than the old 16-bit drivers used to be. They have a different structure, they have different inter-module calling, they have different memory management. There's quite a bit of difference in there. They do have faster code execution, and this is partly because of the 32-bit structure. When you're running 32-bit code, you have fewer 32-bit instructions because each instruction can do more work. They have large sections of the code was completely rewritten. Device protection, for example, PCI bus configuration, resource manager interfaces, memory management stuff. This is all due in large part to the use of the Drive32 driver kit, because it has large sections of driver code that's already written, already debugged, known working. So it makes sense to use these to rapidly produce reliable 32-bit drivers. The USB version 12 code also has better memory management. This is also in result to using the Drive32 code driver kit. It has much better memory management than the 16-bit drivers did. And they have better, faster inter-driver communication. As you know, there's quite a few different USB drivers. There's USB-D, there's the HC drivers, there's all the different class drivers. Using 32-bit flat direct calls makes this much faster and more efficient and more reliable. So, moving on now to display drivers. There is Panorama, of course. It's used in a lot of places. It's stable and reliable. The current version is 1.11. A couple of changes were made to this recently. There was a problem discovered with certain BIOS where there was a compatibility issue where the driver would hang when switching video modes. Very, very similar to this full screen session hang that was talked about earlier, except that in this case, it really was a video problem causing the hang. And there, I found a workaround for that and implemented that for those specific BIOSes. We also enhanced the screen object to remove unused and invalid monitor page, and I also added a new page to handle the custom resolution feature and settings. Even with all these changes, there still is no support for custom resolutions for NVIDIA and Matrox BIOSes, mainly because I don't know how to do it and there's no documentation available. So only the ATOM and Intel video BIOSes are supported for custom resolutions. And by custom resolutions, I mean what some people call widescreen, even though widescreen is not really accurate. Custom resolution means anything that the BIOS doesn't support natively. The video driver is also available. This is not really my project, but I'm including it here because this is really just driver progress, recent progress. So the focus for the first release of Snap was basically getting the code to build and install, which we did, and fix the SMP issues, which we did, and implement the MTRR fixes, which we did. So this now is essentially exactly the same as the Panorama driver with respect to SMP and MTRR stuff. It in fact uses the exact same grad.sys driver for implementing the MTRR changes. Now keep in mind that the Snap project is a collection of drivers, pretty much the same as UniAud, where it's a package. It's one driver that is built out of a whole bunch of drivers. You load it, it detects what hardware you have and then chooses what driver to run. Now, if you happen to have hardware that uses a supported driver, you probably will get an accelerated driver. However, if the hardware you have is not supported by one of the built-in drivers for Snap, it will fall back to a generic VISA driver. This is not an exclusive driver. in support. A lot of the native drivers, the ones that are not the Visa, the default generic Visa driver, might support widescreen, they might not. But beware, the widescreen checkbox in the settings does nothing at this point. Work is still continuing on new Snap stuff. We have plans to implement new drivers and to fix more problems. But, you know, there's only so many of us developers, and time being limited and resources limited. Not a lot of work has been done recently on this, although it is still on our project list and is still one of the active projects. There is one unresolved issue that has a workaround. I don't know if any of you have run into this, but there is the inability to change the resolution and use the advanced push button in the settings if you have installed Snap during a normal Arca OS installation. The workaround for this is reinstall Snap after the Arca OS installation is completed, and then these things should work properly. Let's talk about some disk drivers. The AHCI driver has been updated recently. The current version is 2.05. One of the things I did is I fixed the IO-CTL interface, the IO control interface for the smart utilities. This was working in the version 1 drivers, but it got broken when it got converted to a 32-bit driver. Yeah, the AHCI driver is now also a 32-bit driver. And that little artifact was fixed recently. And I also removed some startup restrictions. One of the things that the driver used to check for was the availability of a PCI interrupt. And it checked for this at startup time. And this made a lot of sense in systems prior to MSI capability. However, recently we discovered that there are some systems that don't even provide a PCI interrupt to the disk controller. And this was causing the AHCI driver to just refuse to load. So we've removed this restriction at startup. An interrupt is still required. However, an MSI interrupt can provide this functionality just fine. And if the driver can find that, then fine. If it doesn't, then the driver will still just later on in this part of code. AMouse is one of the things that is also provided, and it's pretty much stable and reliable. There has been no recent development on AMouse lately. There is only one known issue, and that is the scrolling issue in huge containers. But, you know, time being what it is, there's not been any effort to look at it recently. So one day we'll get to that and fix it. The JFS is also stable and reliable. It's version 1.09.07, and you should be using this version if you're using an older version. An older version does have a problem where it can't corrupt your disk in certain cases if you have a disk crash. So if you're not at 1.09.07, you should be. There is still a known problem. There are very, very rare check disk issues, but it's very rare you would ever see that. FAT32 is also in development, and we have created a version that Arca Noae can actually distribute without violating copyrights and licenses. So that's the one that will be included in Arca OS in the future. We actually did ask Microsoft for a license to distribute EXFAT, and they said no. So it is what it is, and we have to do what we have to do to distribute a copy that doesn't violate license. We did fix various things in the version, like, for example, the volume label trap problem. And I also believe there were some fixes related to stuff. It's not my project, so this is only a brief summary of some of the things that's going on. The FAT32 project. Next up is definitely fixing some of the performance problems and fixing the cache issues. So that will be that is actually being worked on right now. Noae is still available, and even though this product is not technically in development, every now and then I do spend some time and look at various minor issues, and if there is something that can be fixed and something that can be made without any major development, we will build and release a new version. Let's talk about some other drivers. DOS sessions, for example. Beware that there are several different session issues, and each one can affect each system differently. And this is important because, if you found a problem or a fix or workaround that works for you, it doesn't really mean it might work for somebody else. There's quite a few different problems. And this is one of the things that's making it so hard to track down and fix all of these. However, we do have a workaround for one specific problem, the VIOP driver. This driver is available, and it works around one of the DOS session problems on a few very specific systems. It only works on very specific UEFI BIOS that is typically found on a few Lenovo systems. At least that's what we've found so far. It is a BIOS issue thing, and it basically intercepts the BIOS call. Where we think most of the DOS session issues is in the SVGA driver, and we have somebody who is working on this. Time is a constraint for this developer, but he has committed to working on it. And since we believe where most of the problems are, we're hoping that once this is actually gets to be worked on and actually has a solution, we hope this fixes most, if not all, of the DOS session issues. I guess we'll find out. Other stuff that's been happening, kind of related to drivers, is my test log program. The program provides the developer with a comprehensive log of your system. Really can't get other ways. There have been many enhancements and upgrades to the test log program, and it's a good idea to always use the latest version. Now, the number of enhancements and upgrades has really slowed down recently, mainly because it's pretty much about as good as it's going to get. It captures a lot of stuff in the system. So if you have a recent version, you've pretty much got a capable version. It's still a good idea to make sure you have the latest one. It's a really small download, and it's easy to install. It's now a warp-in package, so it's really easy to install it. You can check the version you have just opening up a window and typing test log with no arguments. It shows a little bit of help, and it shows you what version it is. The current version is 3.20. So kind of make sure you've got the latest one. A couple of things to be aware of when using this program is that running it clears the debug buffers in the system. So if you're going to use it to collect a log for a ticket or something, make sure you only run it once. Now, running it only counts if it actually generates a log file. So, for example, if you had your system running along and you had a network problem, your network stopped working or something, so what you do is you reboot the system, you run test logs, you generate the log file, and then you attach it to your ticket. Well, too bad that's not going to be much help, because once you rebooted the system, you cleared all the information about the problem. So you got to run the program when the problem exists, and only once. And only run it in the configuration that produces the problem. See, the test log program does a couple of things. It does capture configuration information, like what's going on in the config system, like what network card you got installed, and those sorts of things. But it also captures in-memory debug buffers. So it's a good idea to only run it when the problem exists and only run it once. Other things that are happening behind the scenes. And, you know, I know everyone has their own pet projects that they want to see progress on. And sometimes it can seem like not a lot's happening, and you can wonder why stuff hasn't been done or why some things aren't seeing more progress. Arca has very limited resources, and there's not a lot of developers to work on stuff. And sometimes things come up that have higher priority or just a lot of time. Like what? Well, like the things we've talked about, fixing problems with booting or with video, or problems with memory. Like some systems we have discovered recently have a little bit different memory layout than they used to, which is causing problems with installation and problems with just booting. The new hardware comes up with issues. These things take time to diagnose and fix. So far, but it does take some time. Handling tickets takes time. And in fact, this has become the biggest time sucker for me, and I'm pretty sure for other people too. And don't get me wrong, it's not that you shouldn't open tickets. You should. If you have a real problem, definitely open it. After all, it's the only way a problem will ever get addressed. However, it would be greatly appreciated if before opening a ticket, you did your homework and read all the readmes, read the wikis, make sure you actually have the problem, and narrow down the problem to the minimum set of circumstances necessary to reproduce it. Once again, I'm not saying open tickets. Definitely open a ticket if you've got a problem. What I'm saying is make sure you've done your homework first. It will help save a lot of time for all of us developers trying to work on it. All the people who need to hear this are actually listening. You know, I don't know. A lot of times the people who come to actually attend workshops aren't the people who actually need to hear this, but we'll see. Miscellaneous other things take up problems, like warp stock presentations. Seriously, though, it really does take some time and effort to prepare, to be here, and to present. So, what if you do have problems? Well, guess what? Read the wiki, the documentations, and the readmes. It's starting to sound a bit repetitive. Well, it's kind of important. Lately, it seems that people are going directly to opening it without reading anything. And that just wastes everyone's time. Here's some hints. If we have to tell you as the first thing after you open a ticket to go read the wiki, or if we have to tell you to attach the log file, or if we have to tell you something that's already in the documentation, then you probably haven't done your job before opening a ticket. Another thing, make sure your problem's reproducible. One-off traps, hangs, or crashes can happen for a lot of reasons. And a lot of reasons that don't necessarily mean there's a problem with the software. Make sure you've got a real problem. Make sure you can reproduce it. Like suppose, for example, you get a trap or a hang, or something just happens once, and you cannot make it happen again. So then you go open a ticket for it. I mean, really? Think about it. What do you really think anyone's going to be able to do about that? So, before you open a ticket, read the practices page. Now, don't think about the best practice page as just a bunch of information you need to read once and then forget about. Instead, think about the best practices page as kind of a checklist or a reminder of the things you need to do when you open a ticket. Kind of like the checklist when you're going to do anything. Like, I'm a pilot, and when I go fly an airplane, we got a checklist of things. It's just so that you don't forget something that you need to do for something. Think of the checklist, the things you need to do when you open a ticket. It can remind you of what we need and what we don't need in a ticket, so read it. And here's another hint. We can tell, So anyway, that's about it. That's what's been going on in the driver world and Arca Noae driver world lately. Sorry I couldn't be there at Warpstock in person. I really do like coming, but it was kind of cost prohibitive for me this year. I hope you guys are all enjoying yourself, and see you all next time.
No questions?
Thank you, David. Let me see if there are some questions from the audience.
What about wireless?
Uh,
He didn't mention that, right?
David, did you hear the question? They're asking about the wireless drivers, if there is any progress or something.
There has not been progress recently on the wireless drivers, mainly because of all the other stuff that has been higher priority. I've been kind of swamped with trying to get USB 3 working. It's mostly done. There's another very important step that I have to get working yet before they're going to be available for use, but that's pretty much all this other stuff I've been talking about using up time. So that kind of is what it is.
Okay, David. Another question that was posted on the forums: if you have an estimated time for the USB 3 drivers, is it going to be this year?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Did he actually rewrite the entire USB stack? Is that, if I understood?
Did I rewrite the entire USB stack? No. What I did is I took the old 16-bit drivers, reworked certain sections of them. Pretty much anything that had to do with talking to the PCI bus, detecting hardware, resource manager stuff, interrupt handler stuff, memory management stuff, all that. And then converted all the other 16-bit code remaining into 32-bit code. Linked it all together, debugged it, and we get what we have.
Okay. Any other question?
Yeah, two.
Okay.
He mentioned for the ACPI that there's some vendors are not as good. Is there a list of them so we have an idea what to expect?
Don't get it.
Yes, there are. In the wiki, if you go to the ACPI wiki, if you go to arcanoa.com, click on support, click on wikis, and go to the ACPI project, and then the debugging, or something like that, debugging stuff. There's a list of vendors there that are problematic. Acer is one of them. Hewlett-Packard is one of them. Those are really the only ones. IBM equipment tends to be pretty reliable, and Lenovo stuff tends to be pretty reliable. Acer stuff is pretty good. I'm sorry, Acer, not Acer. I have a lot of that equipment in my lab. There's a lot of it out there. In general, when I buy equipment to use, I tend not to go for the cheapest thing out there. Usually you get what you pay for in that regard. That's about all I can tell you about that.
You mentioned a driver for DOS, the VIOP. Where's that?
Yes.
You need to get, I'll answer that one, David.
Yeah, okay, yeah, Lewis can answer that one.
That's available from our test case download, so if you go to www.arcanoae.com/test/VIP, I'll give you the link, actually, it's in my DOS presentation.
Okay.
You'll need to use your Arca Noae credentials to authenticate to download it. Because we consider the driver really, it's not in testing as in we expect bugs in the driver, but it's only useful for limited situations. So we want to monitor
Yeah.
who's using it.
Let me, it's a very simple driver, virtual DOS driver. It's very simple. I think it's got like 10 lines of code in it. But the symptoms that this driver can fix is if you open, for example, if you open a DOS full screen session and it clears the screen and puts a couple of garbage characters up in the upper left corner, but you can't type anything, that is one of the symptoms. And a similar thing could happen if you open a DOS window. A DOS window opens and there's only a couple of garbage characters in the upper left corner. But you can close the window and the system keeps running. This DOS just won't work. That is symptoms of the problem that the IoT driver can solve. If you've got other types of things where you open a DOS session and it's saying to just treat the system, this won't work for that. The other problem where if you open a DOS window and it says the system cannot operate this window and it or cannot operate the system in a window or whatever that message is, it won't help that. It won't help some of the other things. It's that one thing where you get the couple of garbage characters in the upper left corner, that's the one.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's limited to just certain machines.
Limited to certain machines, exactly.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so,
All right.
okay, thank you very much, David.
Thank you, guys. Hope you guys have a good time. I'm kind of watching, so keep the feed coming. And somebody try and focus the thing. It's so blurry.
The camera is blurry, he says?
Yes, for the streaming, I'm not able to get it from the source.
Oh.
So the camera is
the
like
stream.
very white. Yeah, no,
That's not gonna make
yeah, no, it's very white, okay.
Yeah, that's not gonna make a good,
Yeah, we will need to,
video.
you have the presentation, right?
Yeah.
Well, we'll
yeah.
have to publish it on the website,
Okay.
okay?
Oh, do I? I will.
Okay, thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time, bye-bye.
USB stuff.
Bye.
Does the USB stuff kind of put that large